I have made this video so many times because I'm tech challenged and it keeps coming down to either the microphone isn't working or my computer is not working or the Wi-Fi is not working. So bear with me. I will probably say more than I want to because public speaking isn't really my forte, but I'm here because I think what I have to say is important. And that is someone coming from the perspective of someone who's been a wife, a divorcee, a victim and survivor of domestic abuse, someone who had disabilities herself, someone who has a child who's disabled and a member of the LGBTQ population. I had a lot of things stacked against me, and yet I kept going. And that being, sex work wasn't something that I obviously wanted to do. I was very Christian or Catholic to be specific, and I was a devout wife and mother. And like many Albertans, my husband went up north and developed a coke habit as well as a gambling one. So the little money that we did have saved up, because we were making decent money, but it was the 2008 crash. And yeah, he blew all of our money away, or up his nose, I should say. And so I left, and I left with nothing. I had to rebuild my life several times because of him. And I'm in a great place now. I'm actually in Mexico right now on a wellness retreat. And I'm a little bit shook because yesterday, just out of the blue, a random homeless man attacked me and assaulted me. And I'm fine. I actually have a funny story about it. Funny story about being attacked. The man was coming after me, and he was like licking my neck, and yeah, he was licking my neck and grabbing me. And so in Spanish, I said that I'm the devil, and I had a demon voice, and absolutely scared the crap out of him and made him roll backwards and run away. The man's probably in a church right now. So I feel like my time in an Edmonton whorehouse, I know it's not supposed to be called that. It's a massage parlor, but that's what it is. It's a brothel. It's a whorehouse. It taught me some street smarts, even in Mexico. But it's very frustrating that even as unassuming as I am, that I still get attacked, that I still have men look at me and I was wearing a long dress, because I've been hanging out with the Amish, which is a whole other story, but I like to be respectful of their culture, so I was wearing a full-length dress, and it makes me angry because, yes, at one point in my life I was a sex worker, but it doesn't stop men from, or anyone who's going to sexually assault. I know there's women rapists, not as common, but it's out there. That was the other thing I found out during my time as a sex worker, is how many female assailants there were. And a lot of my clientele, because I became a dominatrix, and they were there to work out basically what had happened to them. And the amount of female pedophiles out there is staggering. There's a lot of men who don't report because it's scary, and especially when the assailant is their own mother or aunt. Just like women for the last century, and especially in the last 10 years, have come forward, men were coming forward in their spare time to a sex worker because we're safe. But it also is scary. It's you see the ugliness that is humanity, and I also I wouldn't do things differently. Um, I wouldn't recommend it as a career choice for anyone. It's definitely a bullshit job, just the way a lot of jobs are bullshit jobs. And it gave me perspective into the human condition that I couldn't dream up finding in a lab. It was seeing people at their rawest. And when I was able to separate it like that and kind of use it as a case study rather than this deviant sexual act that I was doing, it helped me separate and compartmentalize for my own mental health. And yes, I've had treatment, and the only reason I even qualified for the kind of therapy that I got, the kind of in-depth clinical trauma therapy, was because I was a sex worker in Edmonton. And at the right time, there's a organization called CEASE in Edmonton. I'm not fully on board with them because they are staunch abolitionists, and it doesn't take into effect that people are not engaging in sex work because it's a good option. Sometimes it's the only option. My background was very religious growing up, but I also had I had friends whose parents were swingers, and they were very open about sex. And I got to ask a lot of questions that I wasn't allowed to ask in my normal day-to-day. And that was actually very healing for me, because I see a lot of single moms, and especially single moms with disabilities, which I fall under. I have a couple of autoimmune diseases, including endometriosis. And after several surgeries and other things that had happened, I could not work the way that I was working. I couldn't hold a full-time job. It was too much for me. And so I cut down my hours at work, and I worked 10 hours a week at these different spas. And it provided a really good income when I had nothing, and when I was falling in between those cracks, because as someone who worked for public service, working as a teacher actually, I didn't make enough. I was working early ed, and I could have gone back for my teaching degree, but it would have been too much money. And so I just did odd jobs and did what I could to support my family as my health was failing. And I'm not sure what, I had a whole 20-minute kind of article written up that I was going to read to you. But what I want to say is, there are people out there who, again, the abolitionists, I want you to listen to the people who actually have the stories, not the people screaming that they're groomers or there's pedophiles in the wings, because the people screaming the loudest are generally the ones that are paying for prostitutes, sex workers, for the exact thing that they're screaming about. The people who are, especially right-wing. I know there's still left-wing politicians, and in-between politicians, for the most part, are an interesting breed. I had a lot of clientele that were politicians and diplomats, and police. A lot of cops were my clientele. And even when some of the girls would go because they were getting raped by some of the city cops, Edmonton police is particularly bad for their cops. Stealthing is what they were doing. There was a guy who would promise these girls all sorts of money and then pull off the condom right before, and then push them down and not, until he finished. So a lot of corruption in the police department, specifically in Edmonton. The RCMP, I had a lot of clients, but they were less rapey, I guess. So I'm a little bit jaded when it comes to cops, and I never thought I would be. I thought that they were there to keep you safe. I thought the doctors were there to keep you safe, and all the people that are in charge, the ones making the most money, even some of the chiefs from the reservations that are making these outlandish decisions for people and living in $1 million houses while the people on their reservations are living on nothing. They were my clientele as well, and that also broke me. I am writing a book, collecting my thoughts. Well, like I said, I just had that assault happen. I'm a little bit scatterbrained right now. But I'm not saying this to demonize, again, because I'm not an abolitionist. I do believe that it should be abolished. I would love it if we lived in a world where especially women and marginalized communities didn't have to rely on their bodies to make ends meet. But I mean, I look at someone, I look at the men in Alberta who are breaking their bodies in the oil field, and really it's the same thing. You're still breaking your body for a pimp. And for me, I didn't have a pimp, thank God, but the economy was my pimp. The in between, I can't be in poverty so low that I could get the kind of help that I needed from the government. And if I fought tooth and nail for that help, it would mean that I would not be able to receive anything extra on top of that. If I was well and I was able to even be commissioned as an artist, I would have that held against me. And so there's a lot of social changes that I think need to happen to eliminate things that people don't like. You don't like abortion? You should probably start investing in people who actually want to have kids and making the interest rates not so high and making affordable housing, especially for single moms and single moms who have a disability, available without the laundry list of expectations and obligations that come with all sorts of red tape that if you cross over, you're going to lose your funding. So a lot of the women that I knew who worked in those facilities, and they worked in them because it was safer than being on the streets, and there was cameras, and not where I worked, there was security guards, but we had the cameras, but it was safer than being on the streets. And so there's always going to be issues with this. Edmonton is particularly bad because a lot of the gangs run these brothels. And if you are a buyer of sex, hopefully you're not. Hopefully you think twice, because actually in Canadian law, it falls under the Nordic law model where the sex worker won't be criminalized, which is why I use that loophole to my advantage. But the buyer, the John, will be charged if found guilty. So it's looking at people's humanity and looking at the choices before you call someone a whore, or before you look at them and you're putting someone ahead of someone else because someone had an OnlyFans account, for example. Well, we live in a world where almost like every second person has an OnlyFans or jokes about the foot account they have because the economy's shit and we all need to make a buck. And I'm happy that sex work is in that weird gray zone, at least right now, where it's being talked about, it's being joked about, and in a way that gives power back to the people who are affected by it. However, I see the dystopian stuff going on in the States right now. For example, the States is very anti-prostitution, but up until I think 2017, I think this was in Jersey, but this is rampant everywhere. A cop could go undercover and pay for sex, have sex, and then arrest the sex worker. And so, thank God we live in Canada. Again, if it was illegal, if I was at risk of my kids being taken away, I never would have engaged. But again, it was the right decision at the right time for me. And I would love to say, oh, you don't do it. I just want people to be safe. I want you to understand, if you are going to engage, even if you have an OnlyFans account, make sure you tell someone who's not in the industry. Make sure you have one friend. If you've got nothing, one friend who I'm sure will, even if they're judgmental, but they'll keep your secret. Let them know. Let them know what you're doing. Let them know who you're talking to online. Let them know if someone gives you the creeps. I mean, this is good advice for just people dating in general. Because there is a lot of garbage out there, and there is a lot of violence, especially violence against women, specifically violence against marginalized communities, Indigenous women being the most susceptible to especially murder in our country. Some of the sex workers in Edmonton that have been murdered over the years it's mind-boggling. The police knew who the guy was. He lives in Leduc still. The guy who murdered, I think, 16 different women in the span of 20 years. There was also another serial killer who was probably the same one that murdered another 24 women in Calgary area. So this is something that needs to be taken into account, and hopefully people will eventually be brought to justice. One of the things that I love that has come out of being open about sex work is the bad dates. The bad date accounts, or are we dating the same guy? Those kind of things on Facebook. A lot of those were started by sex workers who were protecting themselves against bad clients. And when you realize that if you got the creeps from someone and they're weird with women, they've probably seen a prostitute before. They probably practiced their whatever fantasies on her, whether it is rape, whether it's incest, whether it's pedophilia, whatever. A lot of times there's practice before they decide to go after someone else or the prostitute herself. I wanted to also, and I know I touched on this before, but because media, social media especially, is just so full of BS that it just, goes in one ear and out the other, you scroll past it. When you see things, when you see people with outrage that maybe seems displaced, and you see parents' rights, or, that's a big one. And I happen to be very involved, not in the parental right movement, because it turns out it's QAnon, and I want to fight. There are actual legitimate organizations like Little Warriors that's actually in Edmonton that deals with pedophiles and all sorts of victims' rights and survivors' rights, and this parental rights, where even Danielle Smith, I was really disappointed in Danielle Smith, because she was touting this parental rights group when it's started by a neo-Nazi. And I think that needs to be talked about more. And talking about grooming in the classrooms, and these books and these book bans and this hyper-Americanized bullshit, because it is bullshit, the hyper-Americanized version of politics that involves populism, which is a playbook out of the Nazi handbook. And so when someone is saying one thing, look into it. Understand that if they've got an agenda, if they're being paid by an organization, and it sucks. It sucks that we need to be this vigilant, but in this age where everything can be distorted, it's best to find out for yourself. It's best to know our laws, know what a Nordic law is compared to this whole abolitionist thing, or straight up decriminalization of everything, because there are perks to each of those, and then there's also a lot of ugliness that comes with that, and there's a lot of trafficking that happens. And not just talking about sex trafficking. Trafficking is a huge issue, specifically in Alberta, more with labor, but sex trafficking falls under that as well, and that kind of gets swept under the rug. And a lot of it is women who can't speak English or English as their second language, and especially women in situations where they're coming from countries, especially refugees. I've worked with a lot of girls who are refugees. They were working all sorts of different jobs just to send money back home. And then you get the girls who, and I'm generalizing and saying girls because most of the time it is women and girls. But then there's the trans community that is also affected. And again, the politicians speaking the loudest and going, these are rights, these are parent rights, and trans people are coming for your kids. Look at their search engines, because there's a lot of, especially American politicians, Republicans, that are out there with their bullhorns talking about parent rights, and they're being convicted for sex crimes against children, or their clients are coming forward and they're, a 15-year-old trans kid. These are real things that are happening, and people who are in sex work are at risk for all sorts of things. Even suicide. You're more likely to commit suicide, and so now that it's kind of, I guess, out of the closet, again, I'm not saying it's good either way. I'm saying it served a purpose for me. It served a purpose because it fed my kids, and it fed me, and it got me out of poverty, and I knew when to leave. And so that's my other advice, is if you are doing OnlyFans to pay for school, for example, make sure that you have an exit plan. Make sure that you are getting educated while you're engaging in it, and get out. And if something does happen, even if the cops are shitty, there are good cops out there that will hear your story. And your story, or even if you're not a sex worker and you have been abused, if we keep talking about it, the people who are the perpetrators, even though it's mind-bogglingly, the rage that is filled in me when someone like Brett Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court in the US, or again, the shit coming out of Danielle Smith's mouth. These are things that affect everybody, and check your privilege especially if you're religious. I mean, I grew up religious, and I still have, after everything that's happened to me, I have a relationship with whom I call God. And I'm not ashamed of it. And yet the people who are touting to be the biggest Christians of all are hurting marginalized communities and touting the prosperity gospel, thinking that they're everything, when really Jesus preached against the things that they've become, and they've become the monsters. And it's taken a weird turn. I'm not sure how what my theme here was, but I hope you got something out of it. And I'm so grateful to Professor King for allowing me to do this on a yearly basis. It's therapeutic for me, and it helps me to get things off my chest and give people information that they maybe normally wouldn't get, or they, maybe your algorithm is not gonna line up to a middle-aged ex-sex worker who's now a lettuce farmer, which is what I am. So be safe, use a condom, get checked regularly, and have an awesome day.